Okay, so here we are trying to understand what's in the middle, and we're going to turn specifically to Europe. Yes, but we also have to remind ourselves that in the middle means between a before and an after. So we're not quite to the Middle Ages yet. I want to situate the big picture timeline of what we're thinking about and talking about on this scale from antiquity to the Renaissance so that we can define the in-between, right? So we've got some things here that should be familiar. This particular image will be helpful or will be available if you find it helpful. But the thing I really wanted to just point out here is that the boundaries of in the middle of what are a little bit squishy, and they really depend on local circumstances. So we're going to turn to the defining feature of the beginning of the Middle Ages, which, as you can see here, is squishy. In some places it starts earlier, in some places it starts later, and it really just depends on how you frame things. Depending on where you are, this is called the late antique from 300 to 600. This is where Augustine, Nicaea, everything that's happening in early Christianity, that's where that is taking place temporally. And as you see these things finishing up, so 400, we would put Augustine like right in here. Augustine is really one of the main Christian thinkers whose work influences the Middle Ages, but he himself is not specifically medieval. He is actually living and working and writing at the time when Rome is in a decline. And so he's a bridge figure that kind of takes us from one period to the next. And that's really key to talking about how do we define this moment between antiquity and the Middle Ages when you have this squishy late antique where it's like, yeah, it's not really classical antiquity, Rome at the height of its powers, but it's also not raw dark ages yet. So the late antique is almost its own in the middle of the middle, except that it's not in the middle of the Middle Ages. It's in the middle of the periods that we're attempting to define. And it shows that these definitions are very much oriented around what we count as important. So we're going to take a few moments to just define the before. We don't need to take as long because we've been spending a lot of time on the before. But specifically in Europe, we need to talk about Rome. And where does Rome fit in this long history of human habitation? And where does it end? Like, where does the Roman Empire end? And that is also turns out to be a really technically difficult question to answer. So we're going to run through that quick as can be. Promise, swear, it's going to be fast. And then we will talk about the two halves of the Middle Ages that are roughly defined as early and late. So here we go. Okay, so as we turn to how does Europe become what it is, we're going to look specifically from a lens of not just Europe, but where applicable, we will use Britain as an example, largely because we today participate in an Anglo-American culture. And so it's good to know how the Anglo part of that fits into the big picture. So yes, there will be a little bit of extra attention on the Anglo portion. We're going to do Europe as a whole, but we're going to use England as a case study, if you will, representative of larger trends. So where do we begin? We've talked a bit about the sort of common culture between Indo-European, and what we have archaeological evidence for is that this culture starts to spread. And as it spreads, it takes on new features and becomes new cultures. But that all of these cultures that we see popping up here are at some point in history, in the deep, deep past, they are related. Then those cultures, these cultures that are popping up on our animated GIF, these are archaeologically created based on the types of artifacts that they left behind. And then we have another type of evidence, and that's the linguistic evidence from Proto-Indo-European, which is the language family that most European and some Middle Eastern languages descend from. So it's important to note, so that origin culture that we saw here, kind of like in here, this seems to be where that Proto-Indo-European language originated. And yes, all of these language families appear to be descended from it, but we want to be careful not to say that because we have this archaeological evidence and then we have this linguistic evidence that we know for sure the story of how these language families and archaeological cultures came to be where they are. It's a lot more murky than what the data visualizations suggest. So let's just acknowledge those fuzzy edges. What we do know is that we have these modern language groups, they exist today, and at some point in history, we believe that the people who spoke these languages lived in these areas. We'll put it that way, right? And some key things that I want you to pay attention to is the Asian portions of this are Scythians, and then the Parthians, Persians, and Medes. These are the also Iranic peoples, both of them. And then they're related on this side to the Vedic peoples who speak an Indo-Aryan language that is the ancestor of Indian. So Sanskrit and ancient Greek are actually related, as are ancient Mesopotamian. So all of these language families are actually interrelated. And that makes some sense when we go way back into the evolutionary history of humanity and we recall their travel across continents. Now we're specifically talking about what's happening in Europe. And as these language families, or as the language families arrive in Europe, which is later, right? They start in here and then they arrive here later. And as they populate this region, they spread out in these ways and they split off from one another. And as they split off from one another, their languages evolve into separate languages, right? They shared a language somewhere over here. And then as they spread out and they separated from one another, the languages evolved into different entities and then different cultures, right? So all of these languages are related to one another. They all come from this origin, but they're all a little bit different as time goes on. Let's put it that way. Key thing to note here, this is where the idea of being Caucasian comes from, because there is some sort of projected origin in the Caucasus Mountains, but that's not really a historically accurate way of describing the mother culture that these may descend from. So Proto-Indo-European is all over the place now also, but there are a few areas, especially in Europe, that speak languages that are not descended from Proto-Indo-European. And I just want to highlight a couple of them. So the Finnish, Hungarian, and a small region within some of these eastern areas, they all speak languages that originate from the Urals. And then there's Basque. That's the other region. I'm pointing to my screen like you guys can see. This region over here speaks a language that we think predates the Celtic occupation of this region. So it's a language isolate, which means nobody else speaks anything remotely close or related. And so Basque might actually be the remnant of the oldest culture in Europe. And as you might know, there's a large Basque population in Nevada. We actually have the largest Basque population outside of Spain in our state. So an interesting fun fact that links the ancient history of Europe with Nevada. Now, peoples of Eurasia that are indigenous to this region, they come from many groups. The key ones that we're going to be discussing are the Germanic cultures, and then the Celtic cultures are actually quite spread out. They really originate here and they colonize here, but at some point, Celtic peoples are spread out across most of Central Europe, Central and Western Europe, and they end up in the British Isles. And then the Germanic cultures, or the Germanic languages, they really centralize here. But I want to also highlight that at the northern ends of Norway and Sweden, you have a different kind of indigenous people that do not come from the Proto-Indo-European stock, and they call themselves the Sami. So that's what's in place before you have the expansion of the Roman Empire. And then Rome happens, it consolidates in the Italian peninsula, and then based on the model that we saw with ancient Greece, which we have discussed already, they start colonizing in a wider way. So now here we are, in early Christianity, and then you have the breaking down of the empire into two different pieces. And once that happens, the Western Empire falls, and the Eastern Empire is all that's left. And so it's kind of weird to call it the Roman Empire. It has a little resurgence, but this is really what ends up becoming the Byzantine Empire. And this is why we say that these boundaries between the Middle Ages and antiquity are a little bit fuzzy, because it's not actually the case that one day Rome is there and the next day it's not. It's that as Rome fades and declines in power, power shifts away from the Roman world. So this becomes a key part of how we tell this story. So let's look a little bit at Rome and what it is and how it occupies spaces. So Rome takes over these spaces that were previously Celtic, most of them, and then North Africa as well. And as it does this and consolidates power, it consolidates its military force in such a way that they take conquered peoples and they enlist them in their military, and then they deploy them elsewhere. And the result is that there is no standing military in a space where the military people come from the neighborhood. Let's put it that way. There's no National Guard. And so this becomes really important. We'll use Britain as its example. So Britain before the Romans is divided up among some Celtic peoples, and in particular, they speak 3 or 4 different versions of Celtic, right? You have Irish Gaelic, you have Pictish in the north, and you have the Isle of Man right here in between, right? Which is a kind of hybrid between that and Common Brittonic. And they have actually a really sophisticated culture, which we've covered in other lectures. So let's concentrate on the Picts. This is not actually a perfectly accurate picture, but those are the people in the north, what is now Scotland, and they have a very particular aesthetic and lifestyle, we'll put it that way. And what they do is they actually paint themselves blue with woad, and that's what you actually see on this modern day person who has painted themselves with woad. And that does get depicted in the media. Like, this is what they're referencing when you see this. The Picts are the native indigenous people of Scotland. Now, Rome ends up invading. So Caesar's the first one to set foot in Britain from Rome, and he just establishes a trading post. And then about 100 years later, after Rome becomes an empire, they're like, yes, let us also consolidate this area. And one of the key things that happens is they come to Britain. Here, let's back up a sec. They come to Britain, they occupy, and they make treaties with the local folks, and they're like, oh, look at these savages, but I guess we can work with them. And then once conditions change, they break their treaties and continue to take over. So Boudicca, for example, is a queen of one of the Celtic indigenous people of Britain. She's the queen of the Iceni, and when the Romans arrive, they make a treaty with her husband. Once her husband dies, the Romans are like, yeah, F that treaty. We're done with that. And they take Boudicca and her 4 daughters, and they not only take them captive, but they rape them, and then they make the mistake of letting them go. So Boudicca raises an army of 100,000 Celts and marches on London and burns that shit to the ground. She's pretty amazing. If you want more on that story, believe me, I could talk a long time on that. But the key thing I'm highlighting here is that you have a cultural difference where you have a very specific gendered social structure, social and military structure in Rome that completely underestimates the more gender egalitarian structure that you have with the Celtic peoples. We don't have a ton of evidence about this because they didn't leave a written record behind them. So what we know is what we've reconstructed from the Roman historians who talk about the native Celts like A, the same way that European colonizers talk about indigenous Americans when they arrive, and B, marveling at the things that happen in their social structures that don't happen for Romans. Sorry, not Europeans. So key things to point out about this. There are some areas of Britain that are difficult to colonize. Most notably, this region right here, that's called the Marchlands, right? Which is the border between Wales and England today. And the reason it's difficult to colonize is because there are Celtic folks in this region and they take up all the high ground up here, which means anybody who's trying to invade from this side has to march through carefully guarded Welsh mountains where they always have the superior strategic position, right? So Wales, very difficult to subdue. Not impossible, but just like always a problem. And then you have Cornwall down here. And part of the reason that doesn't get fully colonized is because they're like, it's just like goes on forever. It's really far away. So Cornwall, not totally conquered. And then you have Pictland. Up here. And so basically the way that I like to give this lecture in my English classes is to say, when have you ever known the Romans to be like, we're good. We're going to colonize this far and stop. That's not really their thing. What they do is they run into these people, and these people are so beyond what Rome has ever encountered that they're like, you know what? Never mind. F it. Build a wall. I mean, a wall. And they literally build a wall across the top of the island. So this is Hadrian's Wall. This is as far as the Roman Empire can get, and they can't get any farther because of the wild Picts farther north. And they're like, nope, never mind. Just shut them out. Just. So they shut them out. Not that that actually is successful. It isn't really. But Rome continues to try to push farther north, and so Hadrian's Wall ends up being successful in a sense because Antoninus, who needs to one-up Hadrian, he tries to do the same thing, except his wall is super dumb because Hadrian's Wall already has a very clear strategic problem, right? Antoninus's wall has a much worse problem. So this wall takes 12 years to build and stands for 8. So not so good, Antoninus. But the key thing about this is that this effort to maintain a northern border leaves this region relatively stable, right? And I say relatively because, But what ends up happening is the Romans arrive, they intermarry with the native Bretons, and they create a new local people called Romano-Brits. And they are distinct from the Celtic people who do not end up intermarrying in Wales, Cornwall, and Pictland, right? And that's kind of a key thing to know, not only about what's happening in history, but literally the politics of Britain today, the United Kingdom. This is all a part of how they relate to one another still. So the key thing about Rome, though, remember, is they're going to enlist native Romano-Briton boys, and they're going to be like, yeah, okay, we're going to send you off to Africa to go fight for Rome there. And all of the legions that they'll bring in here to maintain peace, the Pax Romana, in Britain are going to be sourced from elsewhere. And they do that on purpose so that locals cannot stage an uprising. They never give military power to a local people so that they could resist Roman rule. Which means that Rome brings Christianity. But when Rome starts to struggle, that creates a problem when Rome has to recall militaries from the region. So The common narrative is that when Theodoric marches on Rome and he establishes himself as emperor in 476, this is the end of the Roman Empire. Some people date that differently, and they date it to when the sitting Roman Empire or Roman emperor abandons Rome but is not yet defeated. There's a whole lot of ways to choose when the Roman Empire falls, but the reality is that even though Theodoric is on the throne and he is not a native-born Roman, in fact, a lot of emperors are not Roman in that sense. They come from other areas and they rise to power through the Roman military or political structure. And so Theodoric is just a little bit more not Roman than previous emperors. And he sits on the throne of the emperor, but he's a Goth. And that becomes where people decide that there's something different, that he's a barbarian. Now, Goths, let's look at these. They're the pink folks. We have a number of different types of Goths. And Vandals generally can be called something similar. But the Goths are this red line, and then they break up into groups, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, and the Vandals are kind of lumped into this group, and they end up marching on Rome. But there's a reason that the peoples, the Gothic peoples from here are moving out of this area and into what was the Roman Empire, but is no longer as stable as it used to be. And that is the invasion of the Huns, right? So remember, these folks are part of that Proto-Indo-European family, and they start pushing westward. This is all Attila, right? This is this group. And they start pushing westward. And as they push westward, right, the Germani, they get pushed westward. And the Baltic peoples and the Gothic peoples end up pushing into here. This is the Roman Empire, right? And Rome doesn't have the strength to repel them anymore. And so for their own survival, these people are like, okay, we're out. And the Huns are in here, and the Goths and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals are all moving out of the way of the Huns, which pushes them westward and down into the Iberian Peninsula. And look, they come back up through Carthage, which is kind of amazing. But then they also push the Germanic peoples from here into here, which pushes the Franks from here into here. Franks is where France gets its name from, right? So the Franks are a Germanic people that push on into here. And then you have these northern Germanic folks, the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons, and they also are under pressure to find a new space. But they don't come in quite yet, right? They start migrating, but the big picture for them comes just after Roman legions withdraw from the Romano-Brits, right? So what ends up happening is the Roman legions leave all of these folks unprotected, right? There are no more soldiers left to protect them. And you have a puppet king, his name is Vortigern, and he's there in this area. And suddenly there is no Roman military to keep out the Celtic neighbors who have always been hostile to the Roman presence in the region, right? So what you have is the Picts are back, right? And they start raiding the coast. And you have the Celts from Ireland and the Isle of Man, and they start coming in here to Wales, and Wales starts pushing in from here. And the Scots, what's actually happened in between is the Scots, there have been Scots-Irish have kind of come in this direction. And now we have growing Scottish presence in this region, which eventually mixes with and pushes out Pictish culture, right? And so it's kind of an amalgam culture now, but that is why it's now called Scotland. So Roman legions withdraw, these guys are back, and then you're left with this issue of what do we do in the power vacuum? And this is where the early Middle Ages begin for Britain. So from here, we can now frame our discussion of the middle. Ready? Go.